My presentation this evening is going to be mostly philosophical. But since I'm speaking under the auspices of the Thomistic Institute, it's fitting, I think, to begin with some consideration of the official views of the Catholic Church regarding natural law, in order to give you a sense of how the Church thinks about it, and more generally, how we might think about the relationship between faith and reason. It'd be hard to overestimate, I think, the importance of the natural law to the Catholic Church. Her modes of argumentation, her moral teachings, many of her greatest thinkers, reams of her official documents, all are steeped in the natural law tradition. Just last month, for example, the Supreme Court of the Philippines dismissed a petition asking the court to declare Articles 1 and 2 of the Family Code unconstitutional. These provisions limit in the Philippines marriage to a union between one man and one woman. The court did say, however, that the country's 1987 Constitution does not define or restrict marriage on the basis of sex, gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression, and that Congress could therefore legalize same-sex marriage through the legislative process. This is the latest skirmish in the debate on same-sex marriage in the Philippines. 3 years ago, when Ireland voted overwhelmingly to approve same-sex marriage, a Philippines archbishop warned his countrymen not to jump on the bandwagon, he said. Same-sex marriage is against the natural law, he said. It's also contrary to the canon law of the Church. In other words, we might say same-sex marriage is contrary to natural human morality, according to the archbishop, as well as Catholic moral teaching. What exactly it might mean to say something like this is part of what I want to think about this evening. The 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church, an excellent place to begin reflecting on the Church's understanding and use of the natural law, is divided into 4 parts. Part 1 concerns the Creed and central mysteries of the faith. Part 2 focuses on the liturgy and the sacraments. Part 4 thinks about Christian prayer. Part 3, though, addresses our life in Christ, and before working through the 10 Commandments, includes a chapter on God's salvation, law, and grace. The first part of this chapter, entitled The Moral Law, begins with a section on the natural moral law, followed by the old law of the Old Testament, and then the new law of the gospel. Man participates, says the Catechism, in the wisdom and goodness of the Creator, who gives him mastery over his acts and the ability to govern himself with a view to the true and the good. The natural law expresses the original moral sense, it continues, which enables man to discern by reason the good and the evil, the truth and the lie. The Catechism then quotes Pope Leo XIII's 1888 encyclical, Libertas Praestantissimum, on the nature of human liberty. The natural law, this is from the quotation, is written and engraved in the soul of each and every man, because it is human reason ordering him to do good and forbidding him to sin. But this command of human reason would not have the force of law if it were not the voice and interpreter of a higher reason to which our spirit and our freedom must be submitted. The natural law is, according to the Catechism, an original moral sense that allows us to discern the first and essential precepts which govern the moral life. This natural sense is given to each of us at our creation and can never be fully eradicated from our hearts. Its precepts are universal, and its authority extends to all men. Particular applications of the natural law vary greatly, but nevertheless, and here I'm quoting again, in the diversity of cultures, the natural law remains as a rule that binds men among themselves and imposes on them, beyond the inevitable differences, common principles. In order to underscore this point, the Catechism includes a quotation from Cicero, the pre-Christian Roman statesman and philosopher, who wrote in his Republic that there is a true law, right reason. It is in conformity with nature, is diffused among all men, and is immutable and eternal. Failure to apply even one of its provisions is forbidden. No one can abrogate it entirely. And yet, despite this universal and authoritative moral sense, the precepts of the natural law are not perceived by everyone clearly and immediately. And that is again from the Catechism. And in our present situation, we sinners need grace and revelation, so that moral and religious truths may be known with ease and with confidence. The principal references in the Catechism's discussion of the natural law are to recent church documents, along with several papal encyclicals, and to the writings of Cicero, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas. The Catechism thereby signals the Church's connection to the long and venerable natural law tradition, a tradition that took root in Greco-Roman civilization and was in turn appropriated and extended by Christian theologians. St. Thomas Aquinas, in particular, devoted a substantial section of his Summa Theologiae to the nature and types of law. Indeed, St. Thomas is now considered our paradigmatic natural law theorist. And the Catechism, at the end of its discussion of the natural law, quotes with approval and without comment Aquinas' own definition of law. That definition, which stands at the beginning of Aquinas' discussion of the law, a discussion that lasts from question 90 until question 108 of the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, runs as follows. Law is an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by the one who is in charge of the community. Let me now take a few minutes to think about these parts of the definition of law. Then I want to think about the four kinds of law Aquinas reflects on, including natural law. And then the last third or so, I want to turn to what I take to be some of the most important objections to thinking about natural law in general, and what we might say in response. A law, according to Aquinas, is only a law if it expresses the four characteristics of his definition. First, a law must be an ordinance of reason. A law, he says, is a rule and measure of acts. And the rule and measure of human acts is reason, which is the first principle of human acts, since it belongs to reason to direct to an end. Since a law is a standard of action, and the source of all standards of human action is reason, a law must embody the rational order. Laws must make sense of our human circumstances, such that they genuinely protect and promote our ends as human beings. The speed limit, for example, guides human behavior towards genuine human goods. And as it happens, for a time, this is no longer the case, but for a time the daytime speed limit in Montana was reasonable and proper. This would not work in Rhode Island, I'm afraid. Perhaps not in Boston either. Reasonable and proper, a nice reminder actually of the connection, I think, between law and reason. Second, laws must be ordered towards the common good. In reason itself, says St. Thomas, there's something which is the principle in respect of all the rest. Wherefore to this principle chiefly and mainly law must be referred. Now the first principle in practical matters is the last end, the goal, the final purpose. And the last end of human life is happiness. And since our happiness is most properly a function of the happiness of the community of which we are a part, laws must be ordained to that common happiness or the common good. Although if someone might like to have his own personal speed limit, exercisable in his own personal highway lane, I like to think of this as the HOV lane, the Hain only lane, such a legal arrangement would serve only a private good rather than the good of the whole community. And more provocatively, I think, Aquinas would argue that my own HIV lane would actually not be good for me either. Third, a law must be made by one who has authority over the relevant community. Since laws order things to the common good, and to order anything to the common good belongs either to the whole people or to someone who is the vice-regent of the whole people, I think we should start a crusade to bring the word vice-regent back into common use. Or the vice-regent of the whole people. Therefore, the making of a law belongs either to the whole people or to a public personage who has care of the whole people. I cannot decide on my own what the speed limit should be. even if I know better than others what limit would be best, which at least in my case is certainly true. Only the community as a whole, or those who represent that community, can legitimately make such decisions. Finally, a law must be promulgated. Since a law is a kind of criterion or rule or measure, in order that a law obtain the binding force which is proper to a law, it must be applied to the men who have to be ruled by it. Such application is made by its being notified to them by proclamation. This is one reason why speed limit signs are important. If you don't know what the speed limit is, you can't be pulled over for breaking it. These four characteristics are most easily understood in terms of rather ordinary examples, like speed limits. But Aquinas argues that all four are present in four different kinds of law: eternal law, positive or human law, and divine law, and finally natural law. Positive laws, or human laws, are things like speed limits, laws that a human community forms through a regular legislative process. Such laws are themselves specifications, says Aquinas, of the natural law. Divine laws are those laws given to us by God through divine revelation, including, for example, the Ten Commandments and the new law proclaimed in the gospel. Laws guide us, and we need the special guidance of divine revelation to guide us to our supernatural end, an end that our own nature cannot guide us to on its own. And since our judgment is so uncertain, even in those matters that are natural to us, we need divine laws, so that we may know with certainty what we ought to do. And Aquinas argues that the Ten Commandments are naturally knowable laws, but it was fitting that they should also be revealed by God, so that we might know them with clarity and with certainty. Like human laws, divine laws are ordinances of reason, ordered towards the common good, made by one with authority, and promulgated. The eternal law is the ultimate source of all laws, and is in a sense the mind of God, as manifested in divine providence. The whole community of the universe, for Aquinas, is governed by divine reason, he says. Wherefore the very idea of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe, has the nature of a law. All other laws, insofar as they really are laws, find their source in his eternal law. The natural law, the last type of law, and my principal subject this evening, is our participation, says Aquinas, in that eternal law of God himself. As he says, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way. It has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. To see what Aquinas might mean by this, let's set aside human beings for a moment. For the past couple years, a rabbit has been living in my yard. For a while, we thought it might be eating our vegetables, and so my 12-year-old son tried to catch it with some netting and almost succeeded, but it escaped, much to the satisfaction and delight of my other children. That rabbit is governed by the eternal law, the law of divine providence, as is all creation. The manifestation of divine providence in the life of this little rabbit, and it is a cute rabbit, I will grant that, consists in its natural inclinations and instincts and behaviors. Animals in general act according to set patterns of behavior, and those patterns are expressions of its participation in the eternal law. They are a kind of natural law for rabbits. We humans participate in the natural law, as Aquinas says, in a special way. Not only do we have a set of natural inclinations and patterns of behavior similar to other animals, but we can use our reason to identify the way that we participate in the eternal law. And so we can therefore identify as such what is good and evil for us. And in turn, we are free to choose to act in accordance with our natural law or not. Think of the natural law, therefore, for Aquinas, as the way that our human nature embodies the rational structures of the eternal law, thereby providing us guidance that is naturally available to us regarding good and evil. Each type of law is discussed in significant detail by Aquinas, including the natural law. His topic for all of question 94, which includes 6 separate articles. This discussion of natural law, in particular Article 94.2, which I'm about to summarize, is the site of an enormous amount of discussion and controversy. In fact, I think it's perfectly fair to say that more has been written by Thomistic scholars about Article 94.2 over the last 50 years than about any other article in the Summa. I'm not going to unravel all these debates here this evening, though I am going to gesture towards the main fault lines in order to speak about the contemporary usefulness of natural law theory. Article 94.2 asks whether the natural law contains several precepts or one only. Aquinas' resolution of the question begins with the claim that the precepts of the natural law are, to practical reason, to our practical life, what the first principles of demonstrations are to speculative reason, because both are self-evident principles. The first principle of speculative reason is the principle of non-contradiction. The same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. If you deny that principle, you're unable to speak with sense. You're unable to be understood. The first principle of practical reason, on the other hand, founded on the notion of good, is the following. Good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. All other principles of the natural law for Aquinas are based on this. If Aquinas is right about this, then all of us, in our practical lives, in our day-to-day lives, presuppose that good is to be done and evil avoided. One way of expressing this would be to say that each one of us here pursues what we honestly think is good for us, even if others might think it evil. And to the extent that we think that we are not pursuing what is good for us, we cannot offer a rational explanation of what we are doing. For example, when I sin by gossiping about others, I know that I'm acting badly and therefore not pursuing what is good for me. But it's also the case that I cannot give a rational explanation of my behavior. I freely choose to gossip, but I cannot say why I choose to do it. I wasn't forced to do it, and I knew that I shouldn't have done it. All I can say is, well, I just did do it. This is what my children say to me. And freely so, though I shouldn't have. Aquinas argues that all the other precepts of the natural law are built on that first one. Indeed, as in the case of the rabbit, all those things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good, and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries as evil and objects of avoidance. Aquinas organizes our natural inclinations, and so the natural law, into 3 principal groups. First, he says there is the inclination we share with all creatures, even inanimate ones, to preserve ourselves and to ward off threats. So the natural law includes those precepts commanding us to preserve and defend ourselves as living creatures. Secondly, there are the inclinations we share with animals, and in virtue of these inclinations, those things are said to belong to the natural law which nature has taught to all animals, such as sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth, he says. Finally, we have an inclination to our good according to reason, and thus man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. And in this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law. For instance, to shun ignorance, to avoid offending those among whom one has to live, and other such things. As rational animals, our nature includes a wide range of inclinations, all of which are organized around our achievement of our overall good as human beings. The natural law is, we might say, the rational structure of our human nature, a structure that we in turn have a natural inclination to know and to act upon, even though we can choose to ignore it as well. Aquinas' presentation of all this is an extraordinarily impressive achievement and will be read and reread long after all of us have left this earth. What particular relevance does it have for us now, and in particular for the kinds of moral debates occurring today in the Philippines and many other places? Let me begin answering this question by raising an important problem about how we come to know the natural law. If Aquinas is right, how do each of us learn the content of the natural law? And how, though this is, I confess, less interesting, is the natural law philosophically identified and defended? The natural law is, well, supposed to be natural to us, written into our bones in some fashion. Perhaps we come to know the natural law by observing ourselves and our inclinations. Just as we come to know what is good for rabbits by watching them, so we come to know what is good for us by observing our inclinations, biological and otherwise. This way of thinking begins with a philosophy of human nature, which in turn depends on biology and the other natural sciences. Returning to the problem of human sexuality, we learn, at least in part, what the nature and purpose of sexuality is by understanding the biological complementarity of men and women. I think the best defender of this approach is the philosopher Stephen Jensen, currently at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and a student of the distinguished classical Thomist Ralph McInerney. He argued recently in a very good book called Knowing the Natural Law that we come to know the natural law only by means of first understanding human nature and our natural inclinations, and then concluding from this to the content of the natural law. In other words, we begin with a kind of theoretical knowledge, and then reason from that to the practical moral knowledge of the natural law. But there is another possibility, a possibility developed and championed by a group of philosophers and theologians, often referred to as the new natural lawyers. Have you heard of the new natural lawyers? No, I haven't. No. I like the name. Yes, I'm with you. I like that name too. The most important living member of this group is John Finnis, longtime faculty member at the University of Oxford, as well as the University of Notre Dame, who argued in his now classic book, Natural Law and Natural Rights, that we come to know the natural law not by reflecting on human nature or the fruits of biology, but through practical reasoning itself. For Finnis, knowledge is a human good, something we should pursue. And it is a human good because of the structure of our nature as a rational creature. But we do not come to know that it is good for us by means of a study of human nature. As Finnis says, the good of knowledge is self-evident, obvious. We come to know that knowledge is good for us by means of the practical experience of knowing things, and not by reasoning to the conclusion that knowledge is good from some prior premises about human nature. This is a dispute about how we come to know the natural law, and it has important implications for how one might construct an argument in support of the bishop in the Philippines. Both the old and the new natural law advocates believe that the natural law is an expression of our human nature's rational participation in the eternal law. There is, they would both say, a metaphysical dependence of the natural law on our prior human nature. But epistemologically, that is how we come to know it, these two approaches are opposed to one another. The traditional approach begins with an understanding of our nature and argues for particular natural laws based on that nature. The new natural law approach begins with self-evident goods revealed to us through our everyday practical activities. and from those expressions of the natural law, in turn draws conclusions about our nature. Perhaps it may seem rather difficult to see what is at stake here. Nevertheless, the practical implications are important, since which side you come down on will determine what kind of strategy you use to defend traditional moral teachings, and what kinds of evidence you will consider as potentially threatening to your conclusions. For those of you interested, by the way, in this kind of problem, there's a very nice two-part series on the difference between the new and old approaches to the natural law published in the online journal Public Discourse at the end of September. And may I ask, how many of you know Public Discourse, the online journal? If you're here at this talk this evening, you should go home this evening and look that up. Many, many very interesting thinkers writing today publish short, very interesting reflections intended for the general audience and yet still sophisticated. And you'll find, if you're interested in the topic, this evening's topic, go back and look up Melissa Moschella, philosopher at Catholic University of America, who did a nice job summarizing the questions at issue here last month. I'm not going to attempt a detailed solution to this problem right now, though I'd be happy to speak about this more in discussion if you all would like. But I will say that I find both strategies problematic. For example, the typical criticism directed against the traditional approach by the new natural lawyers is that classical Thomists, like Stephen Jensen and Edward Feser, cannot simply move from premises about human inclinations and biology to moral conclusions without implicitly assuming moral truths that allow them to decide which biological facts are relevant. Under certain circumstances, it is morally acceptable to eat inedible things, for example. But sexual arousal is never permissible outside of marriage. Why is it permissible to misuse, after a fashion, our nutritive organs but not our sexual ones? On the other hand, the typical criticism directed against the new natural lawyers by classical Thomists is basically the same one from the other direction. The new natural lawyers depend, they say, in crucial ways on prior theoretical truths about human nature in order to make a compelling case that the human goods that we identify through practical reason are genuine human goods. I find the parallel structure of these arguments of each position against the other striking evidence that perhaps both positions are in a sense true. My understanding of human nature is always already informed by my practical grasp of human values, and my practical grasp of human values is always already informed by my understanding of human nature. But however this epistemological question should be settled, it is, properly speaking, an argument among friends. As I mentioned before, both parties accept the importance of human nature as a metaphysical foundation for the natural law. The problem is how best to explain and defend our awareness and codification of that law. The deeper objection to the natural law tradition as such is a metaphysical one. Many people find the entire idea of natural law absurd, simply because they find the idea of human nature absurd. The reasons for this are not hard to find. Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, established the discipline of evolutionary biology, a discipline that for some time now has seen little usefulness in the traditional concept of human nature. Human nature, as understood by Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, and many others, picks out the unique human essence, those necessary and sufficient properties. The classical definition of human nature is rational animal, that together constitute what it means to be human. Human nature, so conceived, in turn provides the philosophical foundation for human morality, since it establishes the conditions of human flourishing. It's no exaggeration to say that biological essentialism, a contemporary term that refers to the views of Aristotle and St. Thomas regarding a stable and universal human nature, has been almost universally rejected in the philosophy of biology and theoretical biology over the last 50 years or so. It's not hard to see how this might have happened. Evolutionary theory conceives of human beings as the unpredictable and unstable products of a long genealogical process that does not permit neat divisions between species. There appears to be no set of necessary and sufficient properties possessed by all and only human beings. Instead, the biological world is a continuum of continuously changing individuals and population clusters. Allow me just one quotation from a contemporary philosopher of biology. Because of the variability of life, there are no necessary and sufficient conditions for being a member or part of a biological species. Each individual is different. Some individuals may be missing one characteristic typical of the kind, for example, the capacity to walk upright. Others, a different characteristic, for example, language, despite them all belonging to the same kind. The kind's cohesion is created by genealogy and other evolutionary mechanisms, rather than by similarity. Variability entails that a defensible biological account of characteristics of a kind is statistical through and through, right down to the genetic level. This latter point holds since there is not even a single gene that is strictly shared by all and only the members of a particular species. Therefore, Darwinian thinking with respect to species is populational, oriented towards statistical features of a population rather than typological, oriented towards types, individuals strictly instantiating an essence. Maria Kronfelder, the author of that passage, wants to save the concept of human nature, but she rejects the traditional essentialist understanding and instead believes that it is useful in many other ways and in many different contexts. For example, the concept of human nature might play a purely descriptive role. That is, it might pick out the characteristic features of the human life form that traditional essences had been supposed to explain. Human nature in this sense, of course, would be completely useless for any conception of natural law, since a merely descriptive concept of human nature does not say anything at all about what will make us happy, or how we should act, or what human flourishing and human goodness might look like. Statistically speaking, after all, human beings are not very good and not very happy. This is a difficult problem. If human beings are rational animals, then what do we do with all those apparently human animals who are not particularly rational? This includes the unborn, of course, as well as the severely disabled, and often enough, a significant number of the elderly. If the traditional concept of human nature as an essence that is possessed by all and only human beings remains viable, we need a way to explain its presence in our fellows who never manifest typically human behavior. Despite the withering criticism sustained by essentialist approaches to human nature in the recent past, happily enough, there remain robust defenses of the traditional approach to human nature that can accept Darwinian evolutionary theory and still provide a foundation for a traditional understanding of the natural law. And we are currently experiencing a revival in essentialist accounts of human nature within the philosophy of biology, including thinkers like Michael Devitt, Travis Dumsday, for example. They are a far cry from winning the day, but they have made essentialism an intellectually respectable position again that must be taken seriously. The most promising defenses of classical essentialism begin by reminding us that living organisms are fundamentally different from non-living organisms. And whereas evolutionary biology does present us with challenges to the traditional understanding, it cannot completely do away with the central features of living things that provide a basis for speaking of morally significant natural kinds. To help us think about this in a little more detail, I want to spend my last few minutes on the work of Michael Thompson, a very interesting philosopher currently teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. Michael Thompson is, I would say, the most important student of Philippa Foot, the Oxford philosopher who was a very close friend of Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach. Do those names mean anything to any of you? Anscombe and Geach. Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach, a Catholic married couple, were at the center of mid-20th century Oxford Catholic intellectual life, and well worth thinking about. Michael Thompson, like Philippa Foot, is a defender of an Aristotelian approach to ethics. Not religious, by the way, worth considering. And so a defender of the metaphysical foundations of any natural law tradition. He also takes very seriously the serious objections to any morally useful notion of human nature. Thompson shows very convincingly that the language we use when talking about biological organisms has some very striking features. For example, consider potential definitions of living things. Most attempts to explain what living things are will include a variety of characteristics. Living organisms, we might say, are those that grow, metabolize, respond to stimuli, and reproduce. But just to pick on one of these characteristics, what do we mean by claiming that living things, as opposed to non-living things, grow? To increase in size? The dust piles in the corners of my children's rooms, sorry to continue picking on them, I love them dearly, and they do clean occasionally. The dust piles in the corners of my living room and my children's rooms grow. No, we might say, I mean that living things grow by taking in new material and transforming it into themselves so as to increase their size. Well, lakes and rivers do that every time it rains. Here we seem to have a problem distinguishing between living and non-living processes of growth. We could fix the problem by saying that living things grow by the process of metabolization, but now we have another problem. We have defined one living process in terms of another. And when it comes to defining what we mean by metabolize, it will turn out that we are in a pickle little different from the one we found ourselves in with respect to growth. In other words, attempts to define life end up either unable to distinguish living things from non-living ones, or they end up going round in a circle. Living things are the ones that grow in the ways characteristic of living things. Why does all this matter? It matters because we have a whole series of concepts connected to living things. Concepts like organism, life, organ, vital operation, species, and so on, that can be defined only in terms of one another and not in terms taken from concepts applicable to both living and non-living things. The language of living things is separate from the language of non-living things, and we cannot talk about living things by means of the concepts of non-living things. There is, therefore, something irreducible about our understanding of life. Given that we seem to speak about living things in a special way, a way not reducible to other ways of speaking, consider the following sentence. Black Angus cattle eat grass. This sentence is not quantifiable in any ordinary way. I do not mean to say that all Black Angus cattle eat grass. Of the more than 300,000 registered Black Angus cattle in the United States right now, many of them are too young to eat grass or are fed other kinds of food, such as corn. And I certainly don't mean that this or that particular Black Angus cow eats grass. In fact, it could easily be the case that no Black Angus cow is actually eating grass. As we philosophers might say, I need only imagine it in order to make it so. There's some sad plot afoot, or a hoof, I suppose, and all the Black Angus cattle in the world have been rounded up and will be fed anything other than grass from here on out. Thompson calls these kinds of sentences, Black Angus cattle eat grass, natural historical judgments, or in another place, Aristotelian categoricals. They are categorical in the sense that they do not allow for exceptions. Though, of course, as I pointed out above, I don't mean that this or that particular cow cannot be an exception. Rather, the universality implied by the sentence is a different kind of universality. It is instead something like, all properly constituted and healthy black Angus cows eat grass. And there are many, many similar natural historical judgments that we make. Horses have 4 legs, acorns grow into oak trees, adult humans have 32 teeth. These statements are not straightforward claims about individuals, as I pointed out already. Instead, they say something about the particular life form in question. And as the phrase properly constituted and healthy suggests, they also have implications for normative judgments we might like to make. By normative, I mean statements like a black Angus cow should eat grass, or horses ought to have 4 legs. Statements like these are, each in their own way, statements about health or illness or flourishing. Such statements are, generally speaking, normative judgments because they establish norms against which we judge individuals who measure up, more or less, to the particular standards in question. How many of those 300,000 or so black Angus are healthy? We determine this by looking to the Aristotelian categoricals that apply to black Angus cattle and evaluating the U.S. cattle population accordingly. Thompson, speaking more generally about the relationship between these categoricals and normativity, says, what merely ought to be in the individual, we may say really is in its form. That is the copula we use for Aristotelian categoricals. Ought is the word we use when we speak about individuals. If this way of thinking is right, and I confess that I myself at least am convinced by Thompson's arguments, then we also have a way to ground the natural law tradition. Claims about human morality, like claims about human health, are normative claims that are founded on the human form. Humans have 2 eyes provides a normative foundation for saying that I ought to have 2 eyes, and missing an eye is a defect in human beings. Likewise, humans are rational provides a normative foundation for saying that I ought to be rational, and acting contrary to reason is a defect in human beings. When Aquinas argues that there are 3 general categories of natural laws, laws based on our tendency to self-preservation, to the habits and behaviors of animals, and to the habits and behaviors of rational creatures, he is pointing to the human form as the metaphysical ground for the natural law. And Thompson gives us a way of recognizing this foundation in our language. There remains much work to do, of course, to defend St. Thomas's account of the natural law. All I've tried to do here is point to one very promising strategy for defending the metaphysical foundations for Thomistic natural law theory. In addition, this strategy makes clear what someone would need to give up if the possibility of a natural law ethics were completely discarded. For if we were to accept the objection suggested by evolutionary biology that there are no species determinate enough to ground a natural law ethics, then Thompson's Aristotelian categoricals would be nothing more than human inventions imposed on the world around us, and we could make no sense not only of natural law morality, but of health and disease, growth and decay, life and death, and all those concepts that depend on a larger evaluative grasp of life and life forms. Speaking at least for myself, this is a successful reductio ad absurdum of this position. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to conclude that the natural law tradition remains a coherent and promising approach to morality even after the developments in evolutionary biology since Darwin. And the Catholic Church should remain confident in her appropriation of that tradition as a natural manifestation of God's providential plan for all human beings. This is a sign of the Church's unflagging commitment to the compatibility between faith and reason. The law God reveals will never contradict the law of our nature, though revelation can and must shore up our natural awareness of the moral law And ultimately, revelation must also go beyond our nature. This doesn't mean that natural law arguments will be easy to make, or easy to understand, or non-controversial once they are expounded. I doubt, frankly, that natural law reasoning will win the day in the immediate future in the Philippines, though such reasoning can and should be an important part of whatever strategy the defenders of traditional marriage use to develop their position. Ultimately, the Church's position, like the position of St. Thomas, is a position of hopefulness. The natural world, deep down, possesses a rational structure that reflects the mind of God and harmonizes with Christian revelation. It is possible for us to understand that rational structure, to come to see it and love it by means of our natural powers. For this reason, we should never give up in the face of skepticism about natural human morality. Among the many things for which we must be grateful to St. Thomas Aquinas, not least is his constant reminder to us that God is good, and so what he makes is good. And we, his creatures, by reflecting on his creation, can always hope to be led ultimately back to the Creator himself, and so also his plan for us. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions. Just go for it.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So about, I had a question specifically about this idea of normativity. What is a rubric for deciding which things should have this like is versus ought? Because like it makes sense for like the examples you had, but like for example like a human should have hair, but like for example like colored hair, and then like you could then extrapolate this to something that's a little bit more hot button like sexuality.
Of course.
So how do you think about that?
You asked for a rubric, as if I would love a rubric. So let me come back to some of the things I said in the middle about how we come to know the natural law. One traditional approach says if we can look at biology carefully enough, then we will be able to identify the legitimate norms for human beings. The other tradition thinks, no, we need to somehow more carefully examine our practical lives and behavior, and we will see the self-evident goods that we need to pursue. Let's stick on marriage just for a moment. There are two very good books. If you're at all interested in this question, I recommend both of them to you. The one that takes the new natural law approach, that thinks about the goods of marriage as a kind of self-evident good, is a book called What is Marriage? Very simple. It's written by Robert George, Ryan Anderson, and Sharif Girgis. But if you just Google What is Marriage and Robert George, who's at Princeton, it'll come right up. On the other side, the more biological side, I would recommend Alex Pruss's book, One Body. And in fact, some of you might, I think Alex Pruss came here, I don't know how recently, but some of you might have listened to a talk by him. He wrote a very interesting book called One Body, which I think is probably the best current development of that kind of approach of knowing the natural law. As I indicated in just briefly at the end of talking about those two approaches, I don't find either one of them compelling as it stands. And what do I mean by that? In the case of human normativity, especially in the case of obviously controversial questions like human sexuality, I find judgments of individuals inextricably joined to their own personal experience. So whether or not you find Alex Pruss's arguments compelling will depend in part on how you imagine successful human loving relationships going. Whether or not whether you want to accept the claims that marriage is a self-evident good and exclusive between men and women and so on, will depend a little bit on how you have already experienced certain practical goods in your life. So the short answer to your question is there is no rubric, as far as I know. So how then do we work towards apprehending the natural law? If Aristotle and Aquinas are right, then if you live out the norms appropriate to human life, you will get closer to being happy. So how can we tell over the long term which moral norms are right for us human beings? We have to think about which ones make us the most happy. How do you do that? There's no rubric for that either, right? All of us, in a sense, are in the same bind. We have to figure out what will make us happy. We're only going to live for 70 or 80 years. We have a limited amount of time to find the best evidence we can of what will make us happiest. A lot of our decisions, in the end, come down to our decisions about which observations to trust most. So, if someone were to say to me, how should I decide about which form of life is more in harmony with the natural law, and so which one I should choose for myself? What I would say is observe the people who follow those different models and see which group of people seem most peaceful, seem most joyful, seem most happy in a deep satisfaction way. That's as close to a rubric as I think I can get. Yes?
So, natural law post Aquinas.
Yes.
There's so as far as I understand, I think he analyzed Aristotle and Plato as well.
Yes.
Like
Plato less so, but
kind of made them together with Christianity. And Aristotle, in his case, he has a kind of a rubric, like what would make us happy. Because that type
Yep.
of we will know what is happy because that is our duty to discover as,
Yes.
as a person, as an individual.
yes.
That is modern thinking. That is a modern thinking. But then were the virtues that Aristotle he came up with.
Yes.
So
How does that mesh with what I'm saying, maybe? I'm an Aristotelian, so I take what's going on in the Nicomachean Ethics, the Eudemian Ethics, the Politics, other places, as basically right. That is, the core human virtues, the main ones are the cardinal virtues: justice, courage, temperance, prudence, and then all the families of virtues that follow under those. Those I take to be obviously right ways of thinking about human happiness and human flourishing. But there are two kinds of questions one might face about them. First, let me put it this way. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put together, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed that there should be no unreasonable searches and seizures of citizens' property and persons. But, it all came down to what you called unreasonable. Particular instances, those two countries might have vastly different judgments about whether or not it was justified. So is the case when it comes to something like courage. That is, courage helps you see when you should be afraid and when you should stand up and when you should retreat in the face of what you should be afraid of. Well, we might disagree quite deeply about what we should be afraid of. I'm immensely afraid of lying to my children. I try to avoid it, absolutely, never to lie to my children. No Santa Claus, I'm sorry to say. Playful Santa Claus, but when my 4-year-old says, "Does a fat man come down the chimney to bring me presents?" I say, no. So I'm afraid of, might make me a bad man, I don't know, but I'm afraid of lying to my children. Some people are not. If I'm going to be courageous, I have to be courageous in order to tell my child the truth, or at least shape the truth in such a way that I'm saying what needs to be said and not telling a lie. So, first thing to say about Aristotle. We might accept Aristotle's virtues and disagree about their content. That's still a very serious question. Secondly, we might disagree about what Aristotle might very easily disagree about what Aristotle claims will make us happy. Aristotle says that honor will not make us happy, and that we should not pursue it as a kind of supreme goal. Anybody who's anywhere close to academia knows that honor is the most seductive good that academics long for. We don't get rich academics, but we can be honored, and there isn't a lot of honor to go around, and so we want it a lot. Now, maybe Aristotle's right that honor is not going to make you happy, but a lot of people think it's a major part of their happiness, and they live a life as if honor will satisfy them. Okay, this is a long answer to your question. My only basic response is, I think Aristotle's right, but it's very difficult to defend all of what Aristotle's doing according to a nice, clear rubric. Father.
Just to clarify, there is some, having this vision of natural law rules something out morally, right? It's not just that there's no rubric, so everything's back on the table, and there's a nice way of talking about
right.
that. Can you give an example of something that does get ruled out?
So,
just the way of coming about your answer. Is that what all it is?
I don't know if I understand your question.
Like theft, for example, or something is manifestly wrong.
So,
an example.
Yeah, murder, adultery, theft. Aristotle has just a couple examples of universal prohibitions. He does not frame his discussion so much in terms of natural law as he does in terms of virtue, as we saw. But certainly Aquinas takes that up. Murder is always bad for Aquinas, and the natural law can show that that's the case. How would we argue for that, in response to your question? Well, I would say, look at the lives of those who murder, and often they themselves will say to you, this was a failure. I could have had a better life. I shouldn't have done it. That's the case for theft, the case for adultery for Aquinas, and many, many other moral principles.
So that's, I guess, the point, because of your claim then is that if you, over time, on average, people will see that murder is bad? Or because remember, there's that Woody Allen movie, Crimes and Misdemeanors.
It's a great film. Yeah.
Recreating Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and he realizes, actually, I feel like I got away with it. I'm pretty happy.
My conscience is clear.
Yeah. So, so he's happier as a result of doing murder. So, because the way you're arguing makes it sound like it's, we don't know it's wrong until in hindsight.
Oh, I see what you mean. That we have to experience it in order to see that it's wrong.
Was that what you're arguing?
That's not what I want to say. Okay. What I want to say is that it's almost. I might be willing to say it's never the case that we can see a mathematical proof of what we morally ought to do. We need prudence. So Aquinas balances the natural law with the virtue of prudence, our ability to see what is good for us in the particular moment and not based on a deduction from rules. Aquinas is notoriously hesitant to set down the structure of the natural law according to all the rules. Okay, here's how all they proceed, premise by premise by premise. He gives us the general principles, and then he gives us a discussion of prudence as a way, okay, so I myself, in my practical life, can see that lying to my children is always bad. But I may not be able to give you a clear rubric or definition or demonstration that that's the case. Now, in the case of Crimes and Misdemeanors, which is a fantastic example of a film that wants to show you that a certain kind of act, such as murder, might not be bad for you to do. I think Woody Allen, in a sense, is challenging us to ask how realistic that film is. So at the end of the film, when the main character seems to have a clean conscience and have a very happy life, my response to that would be, well, I'd love to live with that person for a while and see if they really are as happy as Woody Allen wants to make them out to be. Yes?
Since you brought up the example from crimes and misdemeanors, there seems to be a possibility that what is right and wrong develops over time, because was it always wrong to kill an adulteress? I mean, that's a rather specific example.
Yeah.
Killing an adulteress and an adulteress might be considered the proper thing to do, and therefore not murder under certain circumstances.
Right. I would say philosophical. So let's set aside the divine law and revelation. Philosophically speaking, I think if you're an Aristotelian and a Thomist, purely philosophically, you have to be at least open to the thought that morality, in some respects, might change. I myself think that there is a long list of universal moral prohibitions that will never change. I think that's true. They'll never change. Nevertheless, if you are a kind of Aristotelian, that is, if you think that morality is embedded in our life form, and you think also that life forms, at least potentially, could change in certain respects, then you are open to the possibility of change. All that, one way of saying this is, I don't have a mathematical demonstration for you that murder is wrong, although I think it's always wrong, and I think that natural law includes the fact that it's wrong.
I mean, the right answer to me might have been, well, maybe murder isn't, or killing isn't the right punishment for adultery, but the adulteress was still wrong.
Oh, of course, yeah, of course, right. Yes, yeah, the response to immoral behavior is an entirely different question. The question of punishment is different, yeah. Yes, yes, sir.
What would you said that one way we can make these judgments about natural laws by looking at people who do these things, right?
Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who says, well, the reason why murderers' lives are so wretched is because we outlawed murder and everybody sort of internalized this social mores, and it's not really a law, a universal law per se, it's just this thing that was decided as a society, and that's why murderers have such hard lives.
Yeah.
So, how do you combat that sort of objection?
Well, so Dostoevsky, I forget, Father Maloney mentioned Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky was very interested in that potential objection. And so he wrote a novel in which since he couldn't create a society that would remove those social barriers to murder, he wrote a novel in which he tried to think through someone who could kind of do away as much as possible with those constraints. And he couldn't do it for Dostoevsky. For Woody Allen, he's successful. One quick response is, well, we could try it and see what happens. I think it'd be a disaster. Maybe that's sort of the confirmation we need. There is, but if you want to think about a large-scale experiment about traditional moral norms, the large-scale experiment is the population dearth in Western Europe and other Western countries. That is a long-scale experiment around the traditional norms of human sexuality, where populations are in significant danger of going. They've been below the replacement level for some years, and there will be significant social problems over the next 50 years. That's a kind of big social experiment about social norms and the way they affect behavior and so on. And it's a very Aristotelian kind of moment, in a sense. We get to see how it plays out.